China is an economic powerhouse. Now the world's second largest economy, it has risen over the past few decades from an impoverished country to one that could one day challenge the economic supremacy of the United States. Its growing middle class, affluent cities, and insatiable growth in consumer spending are all very visual reminders that this sleeping giant has well and truly awakened. And yet, despite all this wealth creation, there is still a long road ahead. Almost half the country lives on less than $150 per month, and the per capita GDP is around $12,000, similar to Bulgaria or Iran. So whilst China has undoubtedly come a long way from its days as a third world nation, there are still problems behind the facade of wealth and luxury. In 2022, China is stuck in something of a middle income trap. Economic growth has been slowing for years, and rising labour costs have driven manufacturing overseas. But the Chinese have a plan, or a series of plans to be precise, to shift their economy and become a leader in high-tech industries, in a way that will propel them forward to become the dominant economic superpower of the 21st century. When people hear made in China, they generally think of cheap trinkets and low-quality products. The government wants to change that and completely overhaul the country's industrial base. As China became the world's factory in the 1980s, high volume and low cost were key, and the country became renowned for its questionable product standards. Whether or not it's a fair reputation today is open to debate, but the label has stuck. Made in China 2025 is a national strategic plan to upgrade China's industries for the 21st century. You see, China has developed a lot since the 80s, and living standards and wages have increased, which has driven up labour costs and made the low-cost, high-volume model more difficult with each passing year. Factories have adapted and moved away from urban areas to the outer provinces where pay is lower. But wages keep on rising. In fact, they nearly tripled nationally between 2010 and 2020. And so supply chains for cheaper products have now begun to move overseas to countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and India. This is a problem because manufacturing is still such a large portion of China's GDP, and with more of the country's manufacturing base moving overseas in search of cheaper labour, there is a real danger of rising unemployment. To be sure, the rise in wages and living standards is a good thing, but it needs to be navigated carefully so that they don't get the kind of devastation of blue-collar workers that was experienced by the United States when much of its manufacturing moved to China. Made in China 2025 identifies key industries like artificial intelligence, robotics, aerospace, medicine, and green energy, which the Chinese aim to become a world leader in. These are all growth industries which are expected to be a much larger percentage of global GDP in the coming decades, and China wants to position itself to ride this wave of technological innovation. There are many benefits to focusing on these high-tech industries. Jobs created are likely to be highly skilled and high-paid white-collar jobs, and so they can support further wage growth. Value in these sectors is created through ownership of intellectual property and building large networks of users and customers, rather than a race to the bottom on price, which has been the Achilles heel of China's manufacturing sector in recent years. China wants to move up the value chain and transition from a low-cost manufacturer to directly compete with countries like Japan, South Korea, and Germany. This is no small goal, but they have put their money where their mouth is. Over 1,700 guidance funds have been set up at the regional and national level to invest in businesses in key sectors. These act similarly to private equity but use a mixture of public and private funds and only invest in industries that are deemed crucial for China's future economy. Further funding to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars has come in the form of subsidies and low-interest loans that have been distributed through China's state-owned banks. The Belt and Road Initiative is a vast network of infrastructure projects built across the world. Its stated goal is to bridge the infrastructure gap in developing nations and create new markets for Chinese technology. It's pitched as a win-win for all involved. Developing nations get access to Chinese expertise and cheap credit to build roads, bridges, high-speed railways, ports, and electricity grids. Chinese companies employing Chinese engineers and architects get to spread Chinese technologies and standards across the world, and so it's clear how they too will benefit from these projects. In fact, it is estimated that the Belt and Road Initiative will add $7.1 trillion to global GDP by 2040. And it's likely that China, as the orchestrator of these projects, will be one of the biggest beneficiaries of this economic growth. There has, though, been no shortage of controversy. Belt and Road was from the outset met with skepticism in the US and Europe, but alarm bells really started to ring in 2017, when it was discovered that the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, which was built by China and opened in 2012, had been bugged. There were microphones in the walls and furniture, and the computer systems had been secretly transmitting data to Shanghai every night for the previous 5 years. That discovery made analysts think, could all of these infrastructure projects now being built around the world be similarly open to exploitation? It's been argued that many projects do blur the lines between economic benefit and geopolitical and military control. China's construction and control of Gwadar port in Pakistan, part of the coveted China-Pakistan economic corridor, is a prime example. It could allow China to project its naval power from beyond its bases in the South China Sea and would lessen the People's Liberation Army Navy reliance on the Malacca Straits. Naval forces could be housed at a potential future base in Pakistan, and this would allow them to more easily reach the Middle East and Africa. It can't be denied that this would give the Chinese military a significant strategic advantage compared to their current situation. It's because of such concerns about military and intelligence involvement that many Western nations have pulled out of infrastructure deals with Chinese companies. China General Nuclear Power Group was barred from their involvement in the Sizewell C nuclear power plant in the United Kingdom. More damagingly still, Chinese companies like Huawei were shut out of development of 5G networks in the United States and some European countries. However, many of the flagship Belt and Road projects in Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, and Latin America are still going ahead. And as more Chinese money is flowing into these regions, its influence too is growing. At the core of China's future economy will be its central bank digital currency, the digital renminbi. Unlike a decentralized blockchain such as Bitcoin, it is issued and controlled directly by the People's Bank of China. A transaction is cheaper and faster than in the current financial system, because it doesn't need to pass through third-party banks and payment processors. So there are lower fees and transfers are instantaneous. Theoretically, a company in, say, India may be able to use the digital renminbi to pay their supplier in China directly, completely bypassing their country's banking sector. In this way, it will act as a form of digital cash, not reliant on the financial rails we use for transactions today. It's believed that China may push the digital renminbi as an alternative to the US dollar and existing payment systems like SWIFT, particularly in developing countries. If it does gain traction in trade between China and other countries, then it may begin to chip away at the dominance of the US dollar. CBDCs, because of their highly centralized control and susceptibility to surveillance, are controversial, but it's clear that this is the way in which the world is moving, and most large economies have announced that they are developing one. It's all part of the push towards cashless societies. The fact that China raced to be the first country to launch a working CBDC underlines their commitment to getting ahead of the curve on technology and to being at the forefront of innovation. China's development model to date has been to set up special economic zones in one city or province, set out economic reforms in that area, see the results, and if they are positive, roll out changes nationwide. This culture of experimentation, which started with the first special economic zone of Shenzhen in 1980, continues to this day. Perhaps the most ambitious development project in China today is the Greater Bay Area. This region encompasses 9 large cities in Guangdong province as well as Hong Kong and Macau, which collectively make up one of the most heavily populated urban areas in the world, with a total population of over 86 million. These cities are already closely linked. Foshan, for example, is connected to Guangzhou by subway. Hong Kong and Shenzhen are right at each other's doorstep. High-speed rail links mean that none of the cities that make up this region are difficult to reach. The 2 biggest cities, Guangzhou and Shenzhen, are just 40 minutes from each other by high-speed train. The Greater Bay Area project seeks to go beyond this though, and create one heavily interlinked urban area. The construction of bridges and tunnels will drastically reduce travel times between each city. A smart electricity grid, telecommunication systems, and information networks will be built. The purpose of all of this is to allow greater mobility of people and goods, as well as to encourage the flow of capital, information, and data between these cities. The government's plans foresee this region becoming an economically integrated, world-class business hub. Recent developments have led some to conclude that China is slipping back into a more restrictive form of socialism, not seen since the death of Mao. Over the past few years, China has taken increasingly drastic measures to tame its out-of-control housing market. There are restrictions on how many properties each family may buy, minimum times before they are allowed to sell, and even government-mandated prices in some cities. The recent imposition of tough regulations across a whole host of industries has shocked international observers and spooked investors, with many concluding that China's era of economic liberalization is over. Now there are 2 possible interpretations. Either China is on an ideologically driven campaign to return its economy to the tightly controlled socialism of Mao's era, or it is taking a highly pragmatic approach to addressing the various imbalances in its society. Growing pains which, if left unaddressed, could become very serious social problems over the next few decades. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. You see, whilst China has indeed undergone economic liberalization, it is still not a free market economy to the extent of most Western nations, and strict control of its population has always been a feature of Chinese governance. When viewed through this lens, the new regulations do seem more logically consistent, even if they still appear drastic to those accustomed to the free market capitalism of the West. Take the property regulations, for example. House prices have risen to unsustainable levels in most Chinese cities. Wage growth has nowhere near kept pace with these rises, and many young people struggle to even comprehend how they will ever be able to buy their own home. In fact, large Chinese cities now have some of the most expensive real estate in the world. Imagine trying to buy a house in New York City on a Midwest salary, and that's the situation of millions of young white-collar workers in Shanghai and Beijing. To address this, the government brought in tough measures to discourage property speculation and cool down the housing market. Another industry recently shook by regulations is China's private tutoring sector. This is big business in China, worth around $87 billion in 2021. Then, almost overnight, the government imposed harsh restrictions on all after-school private education, even online classes. Companies like New Oriental, TAL Education and 51 Talk saw over 90% drops in their stock prices. The reasoning is that China has a looming demographic problem due to its falling birth rate. This is caused in part by the pressure of raising children, particularly given the cutthroat nature of the country's education system. Rich people can afford expensive tutoring to help their children pass exams. Poorer and middle-class people need to struggle to pay for this and may be discouraged from having more than one child due to these costs. The solution? An outright ban on almost all private after-school education. Extreme, yes, but again there is a logic to it that it is at least driven by economic and demographic concerns rather than being purely ideological. Many policies, though, don't fit with the narrative that these reforms are simply the government's attempt to balance growth whilst addressing inequality and reining in companies that have become near monopolies. For example, a ban on online gaming for all under 18-year-olds except for 1 hour per day on Fridays and weekends was recently brought in. Users will need to verify their age using their government-issued ID card. This is hard to justify from a purely economic perspective, and it's been highly damaging to the gaming industry. Fintech, social media and ride-sharing apps have seen similarly tough regulations. If this trend continues, whatever the government's motivations, then it will likely have a damaging effect on Chinese companies and discourage foreign companies from investing in China. What will determine the future path of China's economy is the ability of its leadership to navigate the next few decades, stimulating economic growth whilst at the same time reducing inequality. China's commitment to zero COVID could also prove to be a hurdle to its economic plans, as the rest of the world opens up and it is encumbered with long and costly lockdowns. It really feels as though the country is now at a crossroads. It will either weather the economic storm and navigate its way through to become potentially the world's largest economy, or it will stagnate and face growing social problems. Whatever happens over the coming decades, for certain, China's development journey will look nothing like that of the United States before it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, subscribe for similar content, and we'll see you next time.